Tina Fontaine was a bright and beautiful 15-year-old Indigenous girl from the Saugeen First Nation in Canada. She was a girl with a future full of potential, a young woman whose life was marked by the love and care of her family. But Tina's story is not just about a life cut short. It's a story of systemic failures, loss, and the resilience of a community. Her life and her tragic death would spark national conversations about violence against Indigenous women and girls and the failure of Canada's justice system to protect them. Tina was born on February 2, 1999, and grew up in the tight-knit community of the Saugeen First Nation, where her family and culture were central to her life. As a child, Tina was known for her bubbly personality and bright smile. She was well loved by her family and community members, and had a natural gift for connecting with others. Like many young people, Tina had big dreams for her future. She loved spending time with her cousins and friends, and was excited about the world around her. But her journey was marked by struggles that no child should have to endure. The first tragedy that would change Tina's life occurred when she was just 12 years old. In 2011, Tina's father, Eugene Fontaine, was brutally murdered. His death left a gaping hole in Tina's life, and the grief of losing her father was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had always been close to her dad, and his untimely death marked the beginning of a difficult and painful chapter for her. At a time when she needed stability and love the most, Tina found herself in a system that was meant to protect her, but instead left her vulnerable to further harm. Tina was placed into Canada's child welfare system, a system that has long been criticized for its failure to properly support and protect Indigenous children. This system often fails to understand the unique needs of Indigenous youth and lacks the cultural sensitivity required to provide adequate care. Tina moved from foster home to foster home, and in many cases, these homes did not offer the love and care she desperately needed. Rather than offering Tina a sense of security, the child welfare system pushed her further away from her community and her roots. As she became more isolated, her feelings of abandonment and loneliness grew. By the summer of 2014, Tina was living in Winnipeg, a city with a deep divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Despite being placed in a group home, Tina would often leave, seeking the affection and safety that she wasn't finding at the home. As a vulnerable teenager, she was just looking for love and attention, but the streets of Winnipeg offered her little in the way of protection. The city had long been a hotspot for violence, especially against Indigenous women and girls, who faced disproportionate levels of violence, exploitation, and victimization. It was in this hostile environment that Tina's life would take a tragic turn. In August of 2014, Tina Fontaine went missing. She was last seen leaving a house party, and shortly after, her family and friends were desperately searching for her. Despite Tina being in a vulnerable state, police contact was made several times during her disappearance. In one instance, Tina was found by police, but instead of being brought to safety, she was allowed to leave. It's difficult to comprehend how a 15-year-old girl, so clearly in need of help, could be let go by the very people whose job it was to protect her. This failure of law enforcement, combined with the lack of support from the child welfare system, left Tina exposed to the dangers of the city. A week later, Tina's body was discovered in the Red River, wrapped in plastic and discarded like garbage. She was 15 years old. The news of her death shocked the nation and sent ripples of grief and outrage throughout her community and across Canada. Tina Fontaine, a girl with so much promise, had been murdered, and her case highlighted the deep systemic issues affecting Indigenous women and girls across the country. Soon after Tina's body was found, police identified Raymond Cormier as a suspect. Cormier had been seen with Tina before her death and was linked to her disappearance. He was charged with her murder, and many people hoped that justice would be served. However, the trial did not go as expected. In the courtroom, the evidence against Cormier was questionable at best. There were no direct witnesses to Tina's murder, no DNA evidence, and no concrete proof linking Cormier to the crime. Instead, the prosecution relied on recorded statements from Cormier, in which he made disturbing comments such as, "She got me in a lot of trouble," and "I don't need to go to jail for this." While these statements seemed damning, they were not enough to secure a conviction. In 2018, the jury acquitted Cormier, finding him not guilty of Tina's murder. This verdict left Tina's family devastated and the Indigenous community reeling. The acquittal of Raymond Cormier sparked outrage. How could someone be allowed to walk free after such a horrible crime, especially when the evidence seemed to paint a clear picture of guilt? For many, the verdict was yet another example of the justice system's failure to protect Indigenous women and girls. Tina's case became a symbol of the larger problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG, a crisis that has been ongoing for decades. Tina Fontaine was not an isolated case. Her death is part of a larger pattern of violence, exploitation, and disappearance of Indigenous women and girls in Canada. The national crisis of MMIWG has been ignored and downplayed by authorities for years, despite the overwhelming evidence of its prevalence. For decades, Indigenous families have been calling on the Canadian government to take this issue seriously and take meaningful action. Tina's death was a wake-up call for the country, forcing Canada to confront uncomfortable truths about its treatment of Indigenous peoples. In 2019, Canada released a national report on MMIWG, which described the issue as genocide. This statement shocked many, but for Indigenous families, it was a reality they had known for years. The report called for immediate changes to the justice system, child welfare services, and police practices in order to better protect Indigenous women and girls from violence. The case of Tina Fontaine sparked a wave of activism and public outcry. Vigils were held across the country, and people rallied to demand justice for Tina and all of the Indigenous women and girls who had been lost to violence. While some progress has been made, many feel that the changes have not come fast enough. Indigenous communities continue to fight for justice, accountability, and meaningful change. Tina's great-aunt, Thelma Favel, who had raised Tina for much of her life, has become one of the strongest voices in the fight for justice. She advocates not just for Tina, but for all Indigenous children who are failed by the systems meant to protect them. Tina Fontaine's death, though devastating, has brought attention to the systemic injustices faced by Indigenous women and girls. Her case is a painful reminder of the work that still needs to be done. Tina deserved a future full of promise and possibility. Instead, she was a victim of a society that failed to protect her, a victim of a justice system that did not serve her, and a victim of a country that continues to overlook the violence faced by Indigenous peoples. Tina's story is not just a tragedy, it is a call to action. It is a call to all of us to demand accountability, to stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities, and to fight for a future where no more Indigenous women and girls will have to endure such violence. Tina Fontaine's life mattered, and it is up to us to ensure that her memory is not forgotten. We must continue to ask the tough questions, challenge the status quo, and push for real change. Until Indigenous women and girls are safe, Tina's story will continue to be told, and the fight for justice will never end. Tina Fontaine was a young girl with a bright future ahead of her. Her life was stolen too soon, and her death serves as a painful reminder of the systemic violence and neglect that Indigenous people continue to face. But as we remember Tina, we must also honor her memory by standing up for those who are still at risk, by demanding justice, and by working to ensure that no other young girl like Tina will ever have to endure such horrors again. Tina Fontaine's story is a rallying cry for change, and it's up to all of us to make sure that her life and the lives of countless others like her are never forgotten.